The thermometer nailed to the doorframe outside read 107 degrees. Inside Thomas Whitmore's cabin, Robert Calhoun stood in his shirt sleeves, ran his hand across his dry forehead, and looked down at the floor beneath his feet with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The stones were cool to the touch, almost cold, and the air inside the cabin felt like early autumn despite the merciless August heat baking the Montana Territory outside. Robert had walked 3 miles in the midday sun to borrow tools, expecting to find Thomas suffering like everyone else. But instead, he found a man comfortable in his own home while the rest of the settlement sweltered in cabins that felt like ovens. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if frontier innovation stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an invention even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1842, and the Rocky Mountain frontier was killing settlers in ways that had nothing to do with bears or hostile encounters. The temperature swings in the high country were brutal enough to break men who had survived everything else the wilderness could throw at them. Summer days regularly topped 100 degrees, turning log cabins into suffocating boxes that trapped heat like kilns. Winter nights dropped to 30 below zero, and no amount of firewood could keep a standard cabin warm enough to prevent frostbite while you slept. The settlers who came west for land and freedom found themselves locked in a constant battle with temperature itself, and most of them were losing. Thomas Whitmore had lived through 4 winters and 4 summers in his homestead near what would eventually become Bozeman, Montana. He had built his cabin the way everyone built cabins back then. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a dirt floor packed hard from use, a stone fireplace in one corner, and a single window with an oiled canvas covering. The construction had taken him and 2 neighbors 5 days. It kept out rain and wind. By the standards of 1842, it was adequate shelter. But adequate shelter on the frontier still meant waking up with ice crystals in your beard during January and losing half your dried meat to spoilage during August because the interior temperature matched the blazing heat outside. Every settler accepted these conditions as the price of frontier life. You burned through enormous quantities of firewood in winter, cutting and hauling logs until your back gave out and you still shivered under buffalo robes every night. You suffered through summer, opening every window and door to try for a cross breeze that rarely came, and you watched your candles melt into puddles on the table. Children developed coughs that wouldn't leave. Adults aged rapidly under the constant stress of temperature extremes. Elderly settlers simply didn't survive their first winter. Everyone knew someone who had died from exposure, either freezing or heat exhaustion, inside what was supposed to be protective shelter. Thomas was a practical man, the kind of settler who noticed things and thought about them longer than most people had patience for. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, learned carpentry from his father, and come west in 1838 with skills that made him valuable in a community that needed builders. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered from frontier life, with the kind of quiet competence that made other settlers trust his work. He didn't talk much, but when he built something, it lasted. His reputation was solid, his future looked secure. And then the winter of 1841 arrived and changed everything Thomas thought he understood about survival. Thomas Whitmore had arrived in the Montana Territory with his wife Catherine in the spring of 1838. They had traveled the Oregon Trail with a wagon train of 40 families. But while most continued west to the Willamette Valley, Thomas and Catherine had stopped in the Rocky Mountain region. The land was available, the timber was abundant, and Thomas saw opportunity in a growing settlement that needed skilled carpenters. He claimed 160 acres along a creek that ran clear and cold year-round, built their first cabin in a week, and spent that summer establishing their homestead. Catherine was 26 when they arrived, strong and capable in the way frontier women had to be. She could shoot, preserve meat, tend a garden in rocky soil, and manage a household under conditions that would have broken women accustomed to easier lives. She had grown up on a farm in Ohio, understood hard work, and never complained about the sacrifices required to build something from nothing. Together, they made a formidable team. Thomas built structures for other settlers and earned cash money when cash was scarce. Catherine managed their livestock, garden, and the endless tasks that kept a frontier household running. By 1841, they had expanded their original cabin, built a small barn, and established themselves as permanent members of a community that saw families come and go with brutal regularity. Their cabin was typical of the era, but Thomas had built it better than most. The logs were straight and carefully notched. The chinking was thorough. The fireplace drew properly without smoking up the interior. He had installed a real wooden door with iron hinges purchased from a traveling merchant, a luxury most settlers skipped in favor of hanging canvas or leather. He had built a sleeping loft above the main room, creating separate spaces in a structure that was otherwise a single large area. By frontier standards, their home was well made and comfortable. Thomas took pride in his work. He had built dozens of cabins for other families, and every structure he touched showed the same attention to detail that characterized everything he did. But good construction could not solve the fundamental problem of temperature control. Thomas noticed things that other settlers ignored or accepted as unchangeable facts of frontier life. He noticed that his carefully built fireplace, fed with split pine and burning hot enough to make the stones glow, could barely keep the cabin above freezing when the temperature outside dropped below zero. He noticed that even with the fire burning all night, the dirt floor near the walls stayed frozen solid from November through March. He noticed that Catherine wore 2 layers of wool clothing inside the cabin during winter and still shivered while cooking dinner. He noticed that the same cabin that could not hold heat in winter trapped it mercilessly in summer, turning their home into a space more uncomfortable than standing outside in direct sunlight. Other men accepted these realities and moved on. Thomas could not stop thinking about them. He began paying attention to temperature in ways that seemed obsessive to his neighbors. He started keeping mental notes about which cabins seemed warmer or cooler, which building techniques might make a difference, which materials held or released heat. He visited the root cellar he had dug into a hillside behind their cabin and noticed that the temperature underground stayed remarkably stable regardless of the season. He examined stone structures and noticed they stayed cool in summer. He watched how his fireplace stones radiated heat long after the fire died down. His mind worked on the problem constantly, turning it over, looking for patterns, searching for solutions that did not yet exist in frontier construction practices. The winter of 1841 came early and stayed late. Snow fell in October and did not melt until April. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and held there for weeks at a time. Thomas burned through his entire firewood supply by February and spent the last 6 weeks of winter cutting and hauling frozen timber in conditions that made every trip into the forest dangerous. He kept the fireplace going constantly, feeding it logs every few hours throughout the night, waking in darkness to maintain heat that barely kept the cabin above freezing. Catherine helped him split wood during the brief daylight hours, both of them working until their hands bled and their backs screamed. It was not enough. Catherine developed a cough in January. At first it seemed minor, the kind of thing that would pass with rest and warm food. But rest was impossible when survival required constant work, and warm food could not overcome sleeping in a cabin where your breath froze in the air above your face. The cough worsened. By February, she was struggling to breathe properly. Thomas tried everything he knew. He kept the fire larger and hotter, burning through their dwindling wood supply even faster. He moved their bed closer to the fireplace. He hung blankets to create a smaller space that might hold heat better. Nothing worked. The cabin could not maintain the temperature a sick person needed to recover. In early March, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. Thomas rode 8 miles through snow to fetch the nearest doctor, a man who served a scattered community of homesteads and did what he could with limited supplies and knowledge. The doctor examined Catherine, gave Thomas willow bark tea for the fever, and told him what Thomas already knew. She needed warmth and rest. The cabin was too cold. If the temperature could not be raised and held stable, her body could not fight the infection in her lungs. Thomas asked what temperature she needed. The doctor said 60 degrees minimum, preferably warmer. Thomas looked at his roaring fireplace, at the frozen dirt floor, at the walls that sweated ice on the interior surface, and knew it was impossible. Catherine Whitmore died on March 19, 1841. in a cabin where the interior temperature had not risen above 45 degrees in 3 months, despite a fire that burned day and night. Thomas sat beside her body for 6 hours, feeling the cold seep up through the dirt floor, watching the fireplace consume wood and produce heat that seemed to vanish into nothing. Other settlers died from violence or accidents or simple bad luck. Catherine had died because the shelter Thomas built could not do the one thing shelter was supposed to do. It could not protect her from the environment outside. He buried her on the hillside above their cabin when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones from the creek. He returned to his empty cabin and stared at the dirt floor that had stayed frozen for 6 straight months. Something fundamental broke in Thomas that spring, but what replaced it was not grief alone. It was obsession. Thomas did not leave the mountains after Catherine died. Most men in his position would have sold the homestead and returned to civilization. But Thomas stayed. He continued building cabins for other settlers because the work kept him occupied, and he needed the income. But something had changed in how he approached construction. He began studying structures with scientific intensity, looking for answers to a question that consumed him. Why could frontier cabins not maintain stable temperatures, and what could be done about it? He started with his root cellar. The underground space he had dug 3 years earlier maintained a temperature of roughly 50 degrees year-round. In summer, when the surface temperature hit 100, the root cellar stayed cool. In winter, when the surface dropped below 0, the root cellar stayed above freezing. Thomas spent hours in that space, thinking about what made it different from his cabin. The answer was obvious once he focused on it. Earth surrounded the root cellar on 5 sides. Dirt and stone insulated it from temperature swings. The mass of earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, creating stability that wooden structures could never achieve. He examined stone buildings in the nearest town, a settlement 20 miles east, where a few permanent structures had been built with rock foundations and stone walls. These buildings stayed noticeably cooler in summer than wooden structures. Thomas talked to the mason who had built them, asking questions about thermal properties that the mason could not fully answer but confirmed through experience. Stone absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. Thick stone walls moderated temperature swings. The mass itself was the key. Thomas visited other homesteads throughout the spring and summer of 1842, ostensibly to trade or borrow tools, but actually to study how different cabins handled temperature. He noticed that cabins with stone fireplaces stayed warmer longer after fires died down. He noticed that cabins built partially into hillsides maintained more stable temperatures than freestanding structures. He noticed that dirt floors, while poor at retaining heat, never got as hot in summer as wooden floors did. Every observation added to a growing understanding that conventional cabin construction ignored principles that could solve the temperature problem. He began experimenting with small-scale tests. He built a miniature cabin model and placed stones inside it, measuring how long they held heat from a small fire. He filled containers with different materials, dirt, sand, gravel, stone, and left them in the sun, then monitored how long each retained heat after sunset. He was not a scientist or engineer. He had no formal education beyond basic literacy and carpentry training. But he was methodical and patient, and he kept careful mental records of everything he observed. By late summer, Thomas had reached a conclusion that seemed both obvious and radical. The problem with frontier cabins was not the walls or the fireplace or the quality of construction. The problem was the floor. Dirt floors were cold and damp but had no thermal mass. Wooden floors were raised and drafty. What cabins needed was a floor made of stone, massive enough to absorb and store heat, turning the entire living space into a thermal battery that would moderate temperature naturally. Thomas spent 2 weeks in September of 1842 walking the creeks and rivers within 10 miles of his homestead. He was not trapping or fishing. He was looking at rocks. Specifically, he was looking for smooth river stones of uniform size, roughly 4 to 8 inches in diameter, worn round by decades of water flow. Other settlers who saw him wading through creek beds, examining stones and setting aside selected ones, assumed he was building another fireplace or foundation. They were wrong. Thomas was planning to pave the entire interior of his cabin with stone. The river stones had to meet specific criteria. They needed to be roughly the same size so they would fit together tightly. They needed to be smooth so the finished floor would not be painful to walk on. They needed to be dense granite or similar rock that would hold heat effectively. Thomas rejected limestone because it was too soft. He rejected irregular shapes because they would leave gaps. He spent entire days selecting stones, carrying them back to his cabin in a canvas sack, building a pile beside his homestead that grew larger every week. His neighbors noticed. Daniel Hutchins, whose cabin sat a mile downstream, stopped by one afternoon and found Thomas sorting through hundreds of river stones, arranging them by size and shape. Daniel asked what he was building. Thomas explained his plan to tear out the dirt floor of his cabin and replace it with fitted stone. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then asked why anyone would do that. Thomas explained the thermal mass principle, how the stones would absorb heat from the fireplace and radiate it throughout the night, how they would stay cool in summer and moderate the cabin's temperature year-round. Daniel listened politely, then told Thomas he was wasting his time on foolishness. Dirt floors were free and perfectly adequate. Stone belonged outside, not inside a man's home. Other settlers shared Daniel's opinion. When Thomas drove his wagon to the settlement to purchase supplies, he returned with unusual items that raised eyebrows. He bought 50 pounds of coarse sand. He bought a heavy iron pry bar. He bought 2 short-handled spades designed for precise digging. He bought a carpenter's level, an expensive tool that most frontier builders never bothered with. The trader who sold him these items asked what project required such specific materials. Thomas explained he was rebuilding his cabin floor with stone. The trader laughed and said Thomas was either crazy or had more time than sense. Most likely both. Thomas did not argue. He loaded his wagon with supplies and river and stones, drove back to his homestead, and began planning the construction process in detail. He calculated that he would need approximately 600 stones to cover his cabin floor. He had collected about 200 so far. He estimated the excavation would take a week. The sand base layer would take 2 days to prepare properly. The actual stone laying would take at least a month if he worked carefully. The entire project would consume most of the autumn, leaving him barely enough time to cut winter firewood. Every neighbor who heard about his plan told him he was making a mistake. Thomas began excavation in early October of 1842. He moved all his furniture and supplies outside, stacking them under canvas tarps beside the cabin. Then he stood in the center of his empty home and started digging. The dirt floor that had been packed hard by 4 years of use came up in chunks. He used his spade to break the surface, then shoveled the loose earth into a wheelbarrow and dumped it outside. The work was backbreaking and repetitive. By the end of the first day, he had removed dirt from a section roughly 6 feet square, and his hands were covered in blisters. The goal was to excavate 8 inches below the existing floor level. This depth would allow for a 4-inch sand base layer and 4 inches of stone above it, bringing the finished floor roughly level with the bottom of the door frame. Thomas worked methodically, measuring depth with a marked stick, ensuring the excavation was uniform across the entire cabin interior. Any low spots would create drainage problems. Any high spots would make the stone layer uneven. Precision mattered more than speed. Neighbors stopped by to watch Thomas dig up the inside of his perfectly functional cabin. Robert Calhoun arrived on the 3rd day, observed the excavation, and asked Thomas if he had lost his mind. Thomas explained again about thermal mass and heat storage. Robert pointed out that Thomas was destroying a good dirt floor and creating enormous work for himself based on a theory he could not prove. Thomas acknowledged this was true. Robert shook his head and left. Word spread through the settlement that Whitmore had finally cracked after losing his wife and was now tearing apart his cabin for no rational reason. By the end of the first week, Thomas had excavated the entire floor. The cabin interior was now a rectangular pit 8 inches below where the original floor had been. He examined his work, checking for level in multiple directions, making small adjustments where needed. Then he began hauling sand. He had purchased the sand specifically for its drainage properties and uniform grain size. He dumped wheelbarrow loads into the excavated space, spreading it with a rake, compacting it with a flat board, checking constantly with his level to ensure an even surface. The sand layer had to be perfectly level because everything else would be built on top of it. The sand base took 3 days to complete. Thomas dampened it with water, tamped it down, added more sand where depressions appeared, and repeated the process until he had a stable, level foundation 4 inches deep. Only then did he begin bringing in the river stones. He had spent weeks collecting them, and now they sat in a massive pile outside his cabin. 647 stones, sorted by size, waiting to be fitted together into a floor that no frontier cabin had ever attempted. Thomas selected the first stone, placed it in the northwest corner of his cabin, and began a construction process that would consume the next 6 weeks of his life. The stone-laying process required patience that bordered on meditation. Thomas could not simply drop stones randomly and expect them to fit. Each stone had to be selected for its specific position based on size and shape. He started at the walls and worked toward the center, choosing stones that would nestle tightly against the log base and against each other. The goal was to minimize gaps. Every space between stones was wasted thermal mass and a potential weak point in the finished floor. Thomas developed a system. He would select 5 or 6 candidate stones from his pile outside, carry them into the cabin, and test each one in the position he was trying to fill. Most would not fit properly. He would take them back outside and try different stones until he found one that seated correctly with minimal gaps around it. Then he would use his pry bar to adjust its position fractionally, tapping it with a wooden mallet until it sat perfectly level with the surrounding stones. A single stone could take 30 minutes to place correctly. The work was hardest along the walls, where the curved surfaces of river stones met the straight edges of logs. Thomas used smaller stones in these spaces, sometimes spending an hour fitting 3 or 4 stones into a section that larger stones could have covered faster, but with poor results. He checked level constantly, placing his carpenter's level across multiple stones to ensure the surface remained flat. Any stone that sat too high got removed and repositioned. Any stone that sat too low required sand added beneath it. After 2 weeks, Thomas had covered approximately 1/3 of the floor. His back ached constantly from bending and lifting. His hands were calloused and scraped. He worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to eat cold meals because his fireplace was inaccessible behind the construction zone. Other settlers who visited during this period saw a man obsessed to the point of self-destruction, ruining his cabin and wasting time that should have been spent cutting firewood for the approaching winter. One afternoon in late October, Daniel Hutchins stopped by and found Thomas on his hands and knees, fitting stones with fanatical precision. Daniel pointed out that snow would fly within weeks, and Thomas had not cut a single cord of winter wood. Thomas acknowledged this, but did not stop working. Daniel asked what would happen if Thomas froze to death before he finished his foolish stone floor. Thomas said he would burn his furniture if necessary, but the floor would be completed before the first hard freeze. Daniel left shaking his head. By early November, Thomas had laid 500 stones. The floor was 3/4 complete. He could see the finished pattern emerging, a mosaic of rounded river rocks fitted so tightly that gaps were measured in fractions of inches. Late one afternoon, with slanting autumn light coming through his window, Thomas noticed something unexpected. The stone surface was reflecting light upward, making the cabin interior noticeably brighter than it had been with the dirt floor. He had not anticipated this benefit, but he recognized it immediately as another advantage of his design. Thomas placed the final stone on November 12, 1842. He stood in the center of his cabin and looked at the completed floor. 647 river stones fitted together in a pattern that covered every inch of the interior space. The surface was smooth enough to walk on comfortably, but textured enough to provide traction. It was level within a 1/4 inch across the entire span. It had taken him 6 weeks of exhausting work, and he had nearly depleted his food supplies to finish it. Now came the test that would prove whether his obsession had been genius or madness. He moved his furniture back inside. The table, chairs, bed frame, and shelves all sat solidly on the stone surface without wobbling. He restocked his fireplace area with the firewood he had managed to cut during brief breaks from construction. It was not enough wood for a full winter, not even close, but it would serve for the initial testing phase. He built a fire that first evening, feeding it split pine until the flames filled the firebox and heat radiated into the cabin. Then he waited to see what would happen. The first difference became apparent within 2 hours. The stones directly in front of the fireplace grew warm to the touch. Not hot enough to burn, but noticeably warm. As the evening progressed, that warmth spread outward from the fireplace across more of the floor. By the time Thomas went to bed, roughly half the floor stones were warm. The cabin temperature had risen to a comfortable level that would have required twice as much firewood with his old dirt floor. Thomas let the fire die down to coals overnight, something he never would have risked in previous winters. When he woke at dawn, the cabin was still warm. The fire had gone out completely hours earlier, but the stones were radiating stored heat. Thomas placed his hand flat on the floor near his bed, 15 feet from the fireplace, and felt warmth coming up from the stone. The cabin temperature had dropped, but not to the bone-chilling cold he had experienced every previous winter morning. He rebuilt the fire, made coffee, and spent the day monitoring temperatures and making mental notes about how the system performed. Over the next 2 weeks, as November temperatures dropped and the first serious cold arrived, Thomas refined his understanding of what he had built. The stone floor required an adjustment period each evening. He needed to build a larger fire than usual for the first 2 hours after sunset, heating the thermal mass. But once the stones were warm, he could reduce the fire significantly. The stored heat would carry through the night. His firewood consumption dropped by more than half compared to previous winters. The cabin maintained a stable temperature that fluctuated far less than the extreme swings he had endured before. The first heavy snow fell in late November. Thomas burned a modest fire and slept comfortably, while his neighbors fed their fireplaces constantly and still shivered. His theory had been correct. Stone was the answer. The impossible had become real. The winter of 1842 to 1843 was milder than the previous year, but still brutal by any reasonable standard. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried fences and made travel difficult. Most settlers burned through enormous quantities of firewood and still suffered from cold that penetrated every corner of their cabins. Thomas Whitmore burned less than half the firewood he had used in previous winters and maintained a cabin temperature that visitors found almost shocking. Daniel Hutchins stopped by in January to return borrowed tools. He stepped inside Thomas's cabin, felt the warmth, and looked around in confusion. The fire in the fireplace was modest, barely more than a few burning logs. Yet the interior felt as warm as cabins where fires roared constantly. Daniel asked how this was possible. Thomas gestured at the stone floor and explained what was happening. The thermal mass absorbed heat during evening hours when he built larger fires. Throughout the night and into the next day, the stones released that stored heat gradually. The system worked like a battery, charging and discharging in a cycle that maintained stable temperatures with minimal fuel input. Daniel knelt down and placed his hand on the floor stones. They were warm, radiating heat upward. He asked how much firewood Thomas had used so far that winter. Thomas estimated perhaps 40% of what he had burned during previous years. Daniel stood quietly for a long moment, then asked if Thomas would help him build a stone floor in his cabin. Thomas agreed. Word began to spread through the settlement that Whitmore's crazy stone floor actually worked, and worked remarkably well. By early spring, 3 other families had asked Thomas for advice on installing stone floors. He helped Robert Calhoun excavate and lay stones in March. He guided Marcus Brennan through the process in April. Each installation followed the same basic technique Thomas had developed: excavation, sand base layer, careful stone selection and fitting, patience above all else. The work was grueling and time-consuming, but the results were undeniable. Cabins with stone floors used half the firewood and maintained temperatures that made frontier winters survivable rather than merely endurable. Summer brought validation of the opposite effect. When temperatures climbed above 100 degrees, Thomas's cabin stayed noticeably cooler than neighboring structures. The stone floor absorbed heat from the air during the hottest parts of the day, creating a cooling effect that made the interior comfortable. Other settlers began visiting just to escape the heat, standing on Thomas's stone floor in their bare feet and marveling at how cool the surface remained, despite the blazing sun outside. The settlement stopped calling it Whitmore's Folly. Some called it the stone floor method, others called it thermal paving, a few simply called them cool stones. But the phrase that stuck, ironically, was the one that had started as mockery: silly stones. The name became a badge of honor, a way of identifying cabins built by people smart enough to ignore conventional wisdom. By 1844, nearly a third of the cabins in the region had stone floors. Thomas's obsession had become standard practice. Thomas Whitmore continued building and refining stone floors for other settlers throughout the 1840s. He never charged extra for the technique. If someone hired him to build a cabin, he would explain the benefits of stone flooring and offer to install it for the cost of labor and materials. Most families accepted. A few declined, unwilling to invest the extra time and effort. Those who declined usually returned within a year, asking Thomas to retrofit their existing cabins after experiencing one winter or summer in a structure without thermal mass. The technique spread beyond Thomas's immediate region. Travelers passing through the settlement noticed the stone floors and asked about them. Traders carried stories of the innovation to other frontier communities. By 1848, cabins with stone floors were being built in Wyoming, Idaho, and parts of Colorado. The specific methods varied based on available materials and local conditions, but the core principle remained constant. Mass moderates temperature. Stone absorbs and releases heat slowly. A well-built stone floor could transform an uncomfortable cabin into genuinely livable shelter. Thomas himself gradually stepped back from building as he aged. He had remarried in 1845 to a widow named Sarah, who had lost her husband to a logging accident. They had 2 children together and maintained the homestead that Thomas had established years earlier. His cabin, the original structure where he had first installed a stone floor, remained solid and functional. The stones he had laid in 1842 still performed exactly as designed, warm in winter, cool in summer, requiring no maintenance beyond occasional sweeping. He died in 1867 at the age of 56, a respected member of a community that had grown from scattered homesteads into an established town. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his carpentry skills and his contributions to local construction, but made no specific reference to stone floors or thermal mass. To his family and neighbors, Thomas was simply a good carpenter who had lived a quiet, productive life. The innovation that had saved lives and changed frontier building practices was so thoroughly integrated into normal construction by that point that nobody thought to credit its origin. But the floors remained. Cabins that Thomas built in the 1840s were still standing and occupied in the 1880s and 90s. Some survived into the 20th century. Homesteaders moving into the region decades after Thomas's death discovered abandoned cabins with mysterious stone floors and recognized immediately that they were warmer in winter and cooler in summer than structures with dirt or wooden floors. The technique never completely disappeared because it worked too well to be forgotten. Modern historians studying frontier architecture occasionally encounter references to thermal mass flooring in journals and letters from the mid-1800s. The practice was most common in Montana and Wyoming, less common elsewhere. Nobody knows exactly how many lives were saved by settlers who survived winters in cabins warm enough to prevent deadly exposure, or summers in cabins cool enough to avoid heat exhaustion. But the stones remain, fitted together by hands long gone, still doing the work they were designed to do more than a century ago.